Thank you for such a very nice introduction, even if you've given away half of the content of my talk already, but that makes it easier to get through. It is good to be here. I won't say back here because it's a different building and a different institution, more than a decade on. It's actually, I guess, it's 13 and a half years since I stopped being director. It's 11 years almost to the day since I left Prio and started work at International Alert. I know it's 11 years almost to the day because on LinkedIn and Facebook I've started to receive congratulations on my work anniversary, and that reminded me. When you get to a certain age, you need social media for that one purpose, if no other. Let's crack on. I'm going to be talking about conflict trends and about some of, at least, of what can be done about them. As Henrik said, I've constantly wanted to straddle the worlds of thinking and the worlds of doing and try to make them into one world. So I thought to begin with I would so partly in order to sort of speed things up, I would show you immediately what the mood and the tone of my discussion about the conflict future is about. And along with that, to give you some keywords that you can be sort of thinking about. These are terms which are going to be recurring through the course of my talk. And one thing that you will not see there is the word war. I want as much as possible to be focusing emphasis onto the idea of compound risks and the idea that what peace policy, for want of a better word, is about is to do with managing compound risks and especially thinking about institutional change. And I'll go into that in a little bit of detail to explain more what I need. But if one's able to manage the compound risks and achieve the institutional changes, then I think that the world can be a better place. So that's my talk in a screen, all right, or in two screens. I'm not going to cover every element of conflict risk, certainly not every conflict or the risks that will drive every conflict. But I want to talk about the big picture. And the first part of it, as Henrik alluded to, is the good news. The second part is not the good news. Then a few thoughts, and then something about peace building. So that's the broad shape of where we're going. And as Henrik remarked in the introductory remarks, peace is the big, unwritten, barely told good news story of the past 20 to 25 years as far as most people are concerned. People who are worried about the world and thinking about armed conflict, including some who are actually really quite expert, are thinking primarily about the bad news of the events that do happen. And that's because actually in the news media it remains the case that news is bad news. Good news is boring. Peace is about as exciting as watching paint dry. War, that's fun, that's exciting, that's what you get the images and the drama from, that's what you can make the good stories about. So expanding the zone of peace has been a crucial achievement of the past 20 to 25 years. And this is a good news map which comes from the State of the World Atlas that Henrik mentioned. It's a good, basically the darker red on it are countries which were, where there was violent armed conflict under the Uppsala definition during 2012 or thereabout, the first half of 2012. The paler coloured countries, the more pinkish ones, they had armed conflict at any point between beginning of 2000 and the end of 2011. So those are the countries where there has been armed conflict during the 21st century. And the little guys charging around, they are symbols for states which have been involved in armed conflict but outside their territory. And the reason why this is a good news map is because there are far fewer countries coloured now than there would have been if I had done this 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The headline figure, according to the Uppsala system, which is as good as any and is reliable and consistently coded, consistently counted, is there were 50 armed conflicts going on in 1990, 30 in 2010. There was a spike in about 93 94, 95, and after that for a decade, quite consistently, the number of wars each year fell. And one of the ways in which to think about that, as for example Andrew Mack and the Human Security Project have argued very firmly and steadfastly, is that it's to do with international engagement. And one sign of international engagement, the UN peacekeeping forces, however poorly funded, however much criticized, however poisonous their politics, and contradictory, vague, or unrealistic their mandates, nonetheless, they have contributed to expanding the zone of peace. And as you can see down here, starting from a very low number in 1950, this is not cumulative totals, by the way, this is the total in each year. There were 2 in 1950, there were 6 in 1980. As the Cold War is coming to an end, the number is starting to increase, and then in the 1990s you get a veritable explosion. Tailing off now. Tailing off partly for good reasons, partly for bad reasons. Good reasons because of the job being done in various places, bad reasons because international donors are quite often somewhat more reluctant to be funding large UN operations than they used to be. Alongside of expanding the zone of peace, there's been an expansion in the zone of democracy. I think it's about possible to say that we're living in a democratic era. It's kind of possible, but if you just look at the numbers, that wasn't possible in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. It's only really in the last few years that the number of people who live in established democracies has approached 50% of the world population. That figure of 48% is from 2012. It was up by 5% from 2008. Also an increase in the number of countries which are established democracies, 51 in 1990 compared to 88 in 2012. Obviously the incomplete part of that story is the fullness of representation. Just one example of that, or one illustration, only 20% of MPs, MPs, that being the English term, deputies, representatives, are women. But even at 20% being women, that's 7 times better than it was at the end of the Second World War. So, anyway, that's basically the good news. Move on to part 2. I give this lecture quite a lot, or a version of this lecture, to places like government training courses, government departments, retreats, in the EU, people getting together to think about this. And what I find is that around this time, this part of the lecture, when we're just about 5 to 10 minutes into it, I have to start emphasizing so that you understand that I am a congenital optimist. I'm a really cheerful, happy person. And I sometimes feel it's necessary to say this because some of what comes next in part 2 does seem to drive some people's spirits down into the ground. Now, either that's because they don't have such a broad perspective as I do, and I am kind of thus intellectually superior to they, or else it's just because I'm very, very happy and cheerful normally, and it takes an awful lot before I get drowned down. But anyway, this is not the good news. And the first thing to think about is maybe raising a few skeptical eyebrows about some of the achievements I was just talking about. The short way to think about them is that they are real achievements and they've been achieved. They didn't just happen along. People worked hard to expand the zone of peace and are still working hard to do it. But those achievements, while real, are incomplete. As counted by Uppsala, from about 1995 until about 2006 or 7, each year the number of armed conflicts declined. That has now bottomed out. And in 2010 there were 30, in 2011 there was a spike to 37. Actually the figures have kind of stabilized again. That's 32 in 2012 and 33 armed conflicts in 2013, all with consistent counting. So we don't know if the trend has reversed, but we do know that so far it's come to an end. It might pick up, it might continue, it might go into reverse. We're at one of those little kind of bends in the road. We don't know quite if we're turning left or turning right. We're going to find out. Secondly, of course, in many of the armed conflicts that we're talking about, there's been no real resolution of the problems. It's just that the violence has been repressed. It's being held back. So there's an enormous risk of conflict recidivism. It's about 20 years ago, Roy Licklider came up with that study, which was that 50% of armed conflicts ended within, 50% of peace agreements broke down within 5 years. I saw a recent study which said it's about 50% breakdown within 10 years. So there's not only been far more peace agreements produced in the last 20 years than ever before, far more than in the previous 2 centuries. But in general, the international community is getting a bit better at making them stick. Nonetheless, 90% or so of armed conflicts are in countries where there have been major armed conflicts within the past 20 to 30 years. So conflict recidivism remains an enormous issue. The third thing is that, as I remarked about the blue helmets when they were all piled up, international donors who normally fund peacekeeping or have normally funded peacekeeping operations are, for pretty obvious economic reasons, getting policy reasons connected to the state of the economy over the past 6 years, getting rather more reluctant to be doing that. Peace processes normally need international support. Even in rich countries, they need international support. The peace process in Northern Ireland could not have worked without international support. Yes, it took political leadership, both in Northern Ireland and by successive British governments who took political risks to achieve the Good Friday Peace Agreement and lay the groundwork before that. But without international support, including financial support, amazingly enough, one of the richest countries in the world, which Britain still is, although we don't often feel that way, received hundreds of millions of euros in the Euro Peace programme for Northern Ireland. That helped fund all kinds of projects and activities and investment and improvement in the circumstances in Northern Ireland. So peace processes usually need international support, and that appears to be getting harder to initiate and harder to sustain. And the fourth thing is that there are other dimensions of violence which I simply haven't been mentioning yet. I've been talking about open armed conflicts, as Uppsala has been counting them now for virtually a generation. Open armed conflict over control of government or control of territory. But there are whole other dimensions that are closer to what we normally think of as crime. And the World Bank in its World Development Report 2011, produced this figure, which now everybody is quoting. If the World Bank says it, it must be true. So, we just all quote it. 1.5 billion people living in countries under the threat of large-scale organized violence. Whether that factoid is in any sense accurate or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is a large problem of criminal violence, which is closely connected to some of the problems of political violence that we talk about, which also needs to be addressed. And it's certainly part of the issues of human security and insecurity which ordinary people face. So those are reasons to raise skeptical eyebrows about the good news. It is good news, but the achievements are incomplete. There are, in addition, long-range pressures coming down the road at us, and I'm going to very quickly go through these, covering terrain which I think ought to be fairly familiar in a setting like this, and therefore not need, I hope, an awful lot of detail. But we've got a Q&A where we can go into it if need be. So the first thing is to do with natural resources. During the 20th century, the price of natural resources was declining. There was the occasional spike in oil prices, but basically the stuff which comes out of the ground got cheaper. Because it got cheaper, that was to a large degree the basis of our expanding prosperity, especially in the second half of the 20th century. This is what McKinsey, the consultancy, said in 2011, that 1 decade of price rises had wiped out all of the price decline of the 20th century. Now, even with the price of oil going down now, the average price of natural resources is on a sharp upward trend. Demand is increasing, and so the pressure around natural resources is becoming more and more intense. That's going to be felt in a variety of different places. It's going to be felt in the Arctic, it's going to be felt in the South China Sea, it's going to be felt in Central Africa, and already being felt, of course, in Eastern Congo, in Kenya, Uganda, and so on. The background to this is partly simply that there's more of us than there used to be. one of the things which occurs to me from time to time is that our politicians very often look kind of, weak, or not even weak, maybe that's wrong, helpless, out of options in the face of some of the world's biggest problems. And I think that is because we're not hardwired to be dealing with problems on the scale that we're now facing. The world population passed the 1 billion mark in 1810. Right? It doubled across the next century to 2 billion. It more than trebled across the next to 7 billion by 2010. And the trend lines mostly go up to about 9 billion, and then different projections taken in different places. But it isn't simply a matter of the numbers of people. These are the figures that you've just seen in that graph. Right? It's not just a question of the number of people, it's where we are living. The percentage of the world's population that is believed to have lived in an urban setting in 1810, when the world population first got to 1 billion, that percentage was, what's the figure which is in your head? The accurate figure is 3. It's now about 50%, and it is expected to go up to somewhere between 65 and 70% by about 2030. Now, cities are not necessarily a problem in and of themselves. I mean, often when you say urban in this kind of setting, you start off by saying, urban problems, urban overcrowding, urban crime, mega slums, etc. But cities are also associated with many good qualities, such as civilization, literacy, solidarity, and also, not surprisingly, because you bring a lot of people into one place rather than having them spread out, with economic efficiency. What is a good way, a 3-word definition of economic efficiency? Consume resources faster. Back to the problem up there. Right. If the business model doesn't change, all other things being equal, then even with this or that bit of recycling here and recycling there and some good people talking about the circular economy and so on and so forth, what we're going to carry on doing is taking resources out of the ground, making things out of them, and building our wealth in that kind of way. And there are many gains to that, but it will create problems in various of the regions which I just mentioned. Alongside of that, another long-range pressure which we should be thinking about is increasing inequality between people, within societies, increasingly visible. The problem of inequality between countries, a lot of people are beginning to argue, is no longer so real. Actually, the wealth per head in the richest country in the world is 200 times greater than what it is in the poorest country in the world. So I think there is an issue of inequality between countries. But mostly what I'm interested in here is inequality among people, within countries, not between them. And it's multiple dimensions of inequality. You can start by thinking about inequalities of wealth, but it's inequalities of voice, of opportunity, of access. It's that feeling of marginalization. And I think that the biggest issue which comes out, 2 things really. One is, the important thing is not inequality alone. The important thing is that it is visible inequality. The second thing is that there is going to be an emphasis during 2015 in the discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN on the undertaking, will it be there or will it not? This is the exciting thing. Are they going to commit the world community to eliminating extreme poverty by 2030? Right? This is going to dominate an awful lot of conversation. Extreme poverty defined as living under, it used to be $1 a day, but inflation has made it living under $1.25 a day. 1.2 billion people. Yeah, but the next 1.1 billion people are living under $2 a day. And above that, the next 1.2 billion are living under $3 a day. As half the world's population lives on less than $3 a day. That's hardly lavish, but it's probably just enough to be able to see how much more other people have. It's just enough to sense what the opportunities are from which you're marginalized and excluded. It's just enough to feel a real sense of grievance and make you recruitable and exploitable by those with political agendas. I think we should have a moment of light relief right now because it's feeling pretty gloomy. And I want to talk about billionaires, because I don't want any of you to think that when I talk about inequality, that I am against rich people. I think rich people are very important, and I'm concerned about them, and they've been having a tough time. In 2008, before the economic crash, there were 1,125 billionaires worldwide. These are the uber rich, and they own between them $4.4 trillion in assets. And as I say, they had a bad time. Only a year later, as a result of the 2008-9 crash, there were only 793 billionaires, count them one by one, and care about them as real individuals. And they only owned $2.4 trillion worth of assets. I mean, some of them were down to their last 100 or 200 billion. It was really tragic. But I want you to know that billionaires are a feisty lot, and they came bouncing back, as they really should do, and now there are more of them than ever, and they own more assets than ever. The economic recovery which is going on worldwide, right, and there is change away from the pits that we arrived at in the crash of 2008, 2009, is an unbalanced recovery. And it is an economic recovery which is increasing inequality. And I'm interested to see that it's no longer the monopoly of wild-eyed leftist romantics to be talking about that. Presidents of the IMF and so on are talking about it as well. And thirdly, amongst the long-range pressures, there's the issues of climate change and the other stresses that we place on the environment. This year, at last, for the first time, there's been proper recognition by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that climate change is a security issue. That there is high agreement and robust evidence amongst scholars studying it that human security will be progressively threatened as the climate changes. And alongside of that, there is the issue of the other areas of the natural environment where we are, as we consume resources, wading in with our boots on, with threatening biodiversity, increasing ocean acidification, and so on. This is a diagram based on the concept produced by the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which suggests that in various areas, chemical pollution, land use, fresh water, the nitrogen cycle, climate change as well, we are pushing up to, and in some cases beyond, the boundaries of sustainability. And the idea of this, that as we head towards a kind of into these areas of the unknown, outside the boundary of sustainability, inside this line here is the world that we have known for a few thousand years. We're not actually quite sure what kind of risks we're taking if we press into several of these areas outside the borders of sustainability. So those, I think, that's the second set of categories for the bad news. Right? Part one of it, or the first half of it, is raise the skeptical eyebrow about what has been achieved. It's real, but it's limited. Secondly, now we have a whole set of long-range pressures coming down the road at us, and we should think about that. So now into part three and a few thoughts, thinking through some of the risks and consequences of what I've been talking about. The first big sort of conclusion to be drawing out of this, I think, is that what we should be most thoughtful about is those areas, those issues where different elements are coming together. I'm not really interested these days in finding out if this factor is more important than that factor in leading to insecurity or armed conflict. Poverty or bad governance or corruption or the state of the natural environment, it's less interesting. What concerns me is where all of these factors which have been identified are coming together. It is as much as anything the response to them, the governance capacity to be able to respond to inequality, an economic crash, environmental stress, natural disaster, slow onset changes in the climate like increasing tendency towards droughts and so on. That's where the dangers really arise, where the risk elements are clustering together. The second thing, I think, is that the interests and the positions that people will articulate in the process of conflict formation will not necessarily reflect any of those background factors that I've been talking about. Maybe inequality, but not necessarily. They will continue to be articulated on the basis of politics, faith, and identity, with the additional factor of outside interests that are involved, whether those outside interests are big mining companies or foreign governments or whomever. So, headline conclusions out of this. Where do I think we should be going with this stuff? Well, first of all, basically, response is not enough. If you're a government or an international agency or an NGO, thinking about how to respond is simply not enough. And if your focus is entirely on crisis response, then it's really inadequate. What is needed instead is to meet problems upstream, where it's quieter, where you can think, where you can actually do stuff. And what is needed is to strengthen capacities for pursuing conflicts without violence. I remain committed to the idea that it's peace when people can pursue conflicts, because I think conflict is important and inevitable, but do so without harm to each other. So, how to achieve that? Well, first of all, again, what I'm about to say now, this is meant to be cheerful. Right? I hope you find that this slide is meant to be cheerful, and I don't need actually to speak during it, because all the words which I want to say are on it, so you can read it. What I find cheerful about this is that if the problems which I think are coming down the road at us now were to have been coming down the road at us in the early 1990s, one would not have had such a strong peace building, peace research, indeed development, indeed humanitarian sector. One would not have got so much experience as there is now. There are training courses, there are people who understand, who know at least something, who've got some experience, who've thought about, who've been part of peace building. It's flawed, it's incomplete, but it's there, and it's a better situation to be in than we were some 20 years ago, faced with these, if one does the thought experiment of imagining being faced with these problems. So, this is something which I saw on my way to work one day. This is life in London. So how are governments and international institutions responding to the threats which I see? What are their policy interests? What's their policy weight at the moment? Most of them are emphasizing the now over the long term. Whether mediation, crisis management, in some cases, like my own government, of course, slowly reaching for the default mode of using armed force. But always the emphasis on the now rather than the long term, whether upstream or long-term recovery. In a very strange way, many of them work out what they're going to do as if there was nobody else active. They get their little piece of turf and they do it. Right? They give nominal but not much practical attention to what other actors are up to. Almost all of them whom I meet acknowledge the importance of analysis. The International Alert strapline is understanding conflict, building peace. And we chose that because we wanted to say that if you're trying to build peace, you must have an analytical basis on which to do it. And almost everybody agrees with us. But linking the results of analysis to practice seems to be extraordinarily difficult. And the fourth thing about it is that they tend to focus on discrete priorities, and everybody gets on with their task. And there's a lot of them. It's a familiar list. The controlling arms, having elections, truth and reconciliation commissions, civilian protection, human rights, migration, human trafficking. All of these are important. All of these are important. But overall, what you see from most governments and most international organizations at the moment is too much emphasis on symptoms, too little on a longer range look. It's mostly specifics, and it's too little of the big picture. Okay, so last 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to try and charge through some slightly more detail on response. Peace building. I introduce you very quickly, in essence, to the way in which International Alert has been thinking about these issues. one of the things which is most important to us is to know whether a society is moving in the right direction, what we should be focusing on in giving our assistance. And we've come up with a framework, 5 peace factors. They're fairly, I think, they're fairly self-explanatory. There may be not much more than common sense. The degree to which power is organized for the common good is an important part of whether a society is becoming more or less peaceful. How safe and secure people are, the degree of human security, not just from armed conflict, but as I was saying earlier, from other dimensions of violence as well. The degree of access that citizens have to a reasonable degree of prosperity, the inequality issue rearing its head. The degree of access citizens have to a relatively fair system of justice, and how well and how fairly people's well-being is looked after. That, I think, is an element of the social whole that we quite often forget when thinking about our own societies, but very often forget when thinking about peace building. And I guess the thing that we have been looking at in International Alert in the last year or so is how do we find our way into this complex set of issues? How they're interlocking. How do we not lose our way? What I'm putting up now is a screen which basically gives you some very, very outlined thoughts that help guide our work. First of all, the long-range pressures I'm talking about lead to stressful social change, and the key to how that's handled depends on institutions. The formal institutions like organizations, like rules, the informal institutions like networks, relationships, understandings between people and between communities. Peace building is a form of social change, and we should not rule out that peace building can also create stress. It can be hard to handle. Peace building, we think, also happens indirectly. It's long-term and it's cumulative. So don't start out on it by trying to tell people it's time to be peaceful, even though you know it is time to be peaceful, and that's pure common sense. Aiming directly at the targets, at the objectives of even increased prosperity or increased access to justice may not be the best way to go about it. It can happen indirectly. Social change which minimizes stress is by definition conflict sensitive. And building peace or helping build peace has to be knowledge-based so that it can be strategic and so that it can be conflict sensitive. And our way in to addressing these issues is through the institutions. There may be others. I'm not saying this is the perfect way. I'm talking about what one organization has decided is the path which makes most sense. And in fact, where we have come to in our thinking is that we think there are 7, as we're calling them, pathways where we want to focus. These are the areas where we think the definitive stressful change can happen or can be handled in conflict-affected and fragile societies. And I will run through them quite quickly. Relations within and between communities. I think fairly straightforward to understand why that would be there. Natural resource management as an issue, it flows straight out of the long-range stress factors I was talking about. Crime, violence, and instability in societies, again, it flows out of that whole issue of the other area of violence and conflict, which we have not talked about enough. The impact of climate change is going to be enormously important across the next 25 to 30 years, regardless of what deal gets done in Lima this year and Paris next year. It can be the climate activists' dream agreement, and still there will be 2, 3, or 4 decades of consequences of climate change and the pressure that creates to be handling. None of what we're talking about in the previous 4 pathways is actually possible unless we manage to address and help people to address the ways in which we are as people, our basic modes of our self-identity. And gender is central to that. The insight that we produced, it came up in one workshop, was somebody said, you're talking about gender-based violence, as we often do. Right? But gender-based violence tends to mean sexual violence of men against women and sometimes against men. But actually, all violence is gender-based. That was the insight. That's what we're sort of exploring in our work at the moment. Citizenship in the state, the relationship, it's often called a social contract. In development circles, the trend term is the political settlement, is fundamental also to whether there's going to be a peaceful society or not. And lastly, if you're not paying attention to the political economy and the realities of power in a society, then it is a bit unlikely that you will be able to contribute very much towards peace. It's a challenging set of areas. It's a challenging task. You probably need to be almost as optimistic as I am to want to take it on. So thank you very much for your attention. And I just want to show you one last piece of art from London. This is pavement art that was outside our front door. And I like it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for a very thought-provoking and clear presentation. I'm glad that you were able to expand a little bit on my initial comments. And for a sort of a grave topic, I thought the presentation was very inspiring. We're gonna open the floor now for questions and comments. I'm probably gonna try to collect some for Dan. I have two requests. The first one is to clearly present yourself, and I'll start with myself and give a good example. I'm Henrik Urdal, and I'm a research professor at Prio and also heading the Conflict Trends project. And I'm also editor of one of the Prio journals, the Journal of Peace Research. The second request is that I ask you to talk loud when you ask the question, both for the benefit of everyone else and for the benefit of the camera, because we will be posting this afterwards. So the floor is open. If anyone want to comment, I'm sure that there must be, Dan was covering a host of questions that are, yeah. So I think we'll have to take them piecewise, but feel free to bring up whatever you want to. Nick.
Nick Marsh from here in Prio. You're in a research institute, Dan, and welcome back. Your 7 pathways, etc., as you said, are quite frightening in how complex and difficult they are to deal with. What advice can you give to the researchers in terms of what should we be looking at? How can we assist you?
Do you want me to
go ahead? Yeah.
I think that first off, as I said, the essential thing is to focus in on compound risk, on where those different factors, those different elements that generate conflict, but also maybe generate possibilities for addressing conflicts in peaceful ways. Look at the points of intersection. I find studies which are oriented towards understanding how one factor contributes may be an important part of clearing the ground or of thinking through the theory, but it's not going to of itself produce ideas which are helpful. The second thing, really to be straightforward, is I would say go to the pathways and start figuring. There are huge areas of uncertainty in all of these. I mean, the first one, relations within and between communities, looks very, very familiar as something that in reconciliation work or different peace-loving NGOs do and so on. But actually there's an awful lot which is not known about how things work and why they work. So there's a big area there to bring together different research approaches, whether from social psychology and political science, meeting up together. And I could do that talking through each one of those. But remember the complexity of the world which one is trying to use these as lenses on. That would be my first headline thought for a research agenda.
Now I have a little bit of a list, so I think we'll collect a few questions. Håvard.
I'm Håvard Hegre. I'm a research professor at Prio and also a professor at Uppsala University. So what you're saying is very interesting and very thoughtful, and I share most of your recommendations. But there's one thing which I find puzzlingly missing from the analysis. I should say I'm also running a prediction project here at Prio where we get results which are even more positive and optimistic than you are. So that's a good background for this question. So what I'm missing here is a focus on socioeconomic development. We know that over the last 50 years, the well-being of the global population has improved immensely. So infant mortality rates have been decreased by 70%. Education levels, literacy levels are changing in a positive direction. Dramatic changes globally. Poverty is reduced at least as a proportion of population. So, and we also know that socioeconomic development underpins good governance and also is associated with a reduction in conflict. So it's an independent driver of peace and good governance. So I'm wondering why that's not listed as a complement, as a sort of a counteracting factor to your risk, because there are also good reasons to think that these changes will continue over the next 2 decades. So that's one thing. Why? What is the impact of the analysis of the expected changes in socioeconomic development, and also how they play into the pathways that you list here?
Before going on to this, I would just like to piggyback on Håvard's comment addressing one of the issues that are brought up, which is close to my heart, which is the question of urbanization, because very closely connected to the general sort of socioeconomic development is certainly the urbanization. So urban populations generally have higher levels of education, better health, higher incomes, and in most cases they're also using less energy because they can live efficiently. They can be transported efficiently. So I would like to challenge you a little bit on the prospects of urbanization, because I think there is a sense, particularly in the Nordic countries, of sort of romanticizing rural life and rural projects, which includes the way that we are providing development aid. And on the other hand, sort of overestimating the urban ills, and I think that could be counterproductive. But I'll give the floor to 2 more people before you get to answer. Inge.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Welcome back. My name is Inger Kjelsbæk. I'm the deputy director at Prio. And in a way to follow up on what Nick addressed, you're back at Prio. We try to do our best with the research that we do, and you said in your presentation that using knowledge is notoriously difficult. But could you expand a little bit on that and how to communicate better, and what you see now? You've been at international work for I don't know how long, but what are the advice back to us in a way how to communicate research better? Because you're challenging us to be even more complex in how we do our research, and that makes an even more difficult communication challenge, I think.
Thank you. One more.
Yes, thank you, Dan. My name is Ingeborg Breinus. I'm the co-president of the International Peace Bureau. I have a few concerns that I wanted to raise and have your comments. One is that there is a confrontational language that is quite scary. And when we speak about societies becoming more peaceful, it is not what we hear when we hear our politicians these days. So what to do about the language? Is it reflecting a stronger militarization of society, which is also a quite scary trend? And when we speak about solutions, it's almost from the media that solutions are military solutions. So we are not good enough at coming up with the nonviolent solutions that are there. And it might have to do with what you say, that governments look for short-term solutions and not long-term, and violent solutions, so-called, might be quicker. The last thing is that I thought you would have addressed is the sidelining of the UN. The UN is being spoken down. The big powers gather in the 7 and the 20 and the World Trade Organization and World Bank, IMF, etc. And I'm wondering if the UN, which was made for us, the people, but in fact it is the governments that are meeting there now, are being sidelined because it's the multinationals that have the powers these days, and the legal system, international law, seem not to be fit to tackle multinational, the situation that we are living where governments have less power and the multinationals much more? Thank you.
Thank you. That's 3 quite challenging questions and diverse as well. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I'll take them in order. So the first pair, and then from Hogard and you, and then Inge's question, and then Ingeborg's. In terms of socioeconomic development as a positive, yes, I think there's an awful lot of mileage in that. Probably, to be straightforward, the real reason why I haven't put a lot of emphasis on it is that in the debates in which I'm engaged in the sort of broad milieu within which International Alert operates, there are still too many people, in my view, who think that development solves the problem, and that I think is dangerous. Even now, I still occasionally get told by somebody, yes, but you're talking about peace. I do development. My colleague down the corridor does, over the road in a different building, whom I never talk to. He or she does peace. And so I think that it's a kind of, it's basically a rhetorical choice on my part to emphasize the peace and the political issues because of who I'm arguing with. But I mean, for sure, the literacy and health indicators are better. But the economic development as such, there I think we would have an interesting conversation about. Because, one calculation is that about 60% of all wealth existing today basically came out of the earth. What we do is we take stuff out of the earth, we do things to it, called industry, and then we sell it on. And this is how wealth gets generated. For the rest, you've got the finance sector, which is just moving money around. And then you've got the services which are bought and sold by the people who've got some share of that wealth which originally came out of the ground. So from that point of view, economic development, however it was done, must be producing some of the pressures which lead to conflicts. And some of those conflicts then are unmanageable. So, and I think that a historical survey confirms that. Socioeconomic development is a good and a problem at the same time. And how to balance that seems to me to be one of the central challenges. Where I've touched on that in the talk which I've just given and in the things which I've written is by looking at natural resource management, because that is the issue which on the one hand touches some of the big trends in the world economy, and on the other hand is most real in some of the areas where International Alert is working, like in Eastern Congo, Nigeria, West Africa, and so on. As to urbanization, I'm not quite sure what it is that you thought we might disagree about, or that you were challenging me on. Because, as I said, urbanization, yes, one can talk about all the problems, but it is associated with a whole lot of very good things, starting with civilization, literacy, solidarity, and so on. And while you certainly get efficiency of some kinds, and therefore less consumption of energy than you would do, I think there's a counterfactual argument. Would you get the same degree of consumption if you weren't in the first place together in cities? So that comparing the consumption, the efficiency of the consumption we achieve in cities compared to the efficiency of achieving the same consumption in highly dispersed populations might be a false comparison. But I certainly think that if you look at the history of urbanization, you see a history of increased economic output, increased economic production. And however much at the moment we are making the consumption of energy and a few other goods more efficient, nonetheless the overall scale of consumption is going up, and that's where my concern lies. But I am not arguing for a back to the country or back to the land kind of dewy-eyed romantic view about that. Certainly not for myself. I need my cortado. It's straightforward with that. The question of using knowledge, Inge, I think probably my view in principle hasn't changed since I was here, but it's now more nuanced. And I understand if you want to get attention for something that you are doing, researching, conceiving, you have to think very hard about how to get that attention. I'm on, or I have been for the last couple of years, on a commissioning panel for the UK Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, on a panel for commissioning research on poverty alleviation research. And one of the things which the applicants have to do is to show an impact pathway. Right? So they have to show how this is going to have an effect. And it's kind of, sometimes it's kind of sad when you read it, you know. Well, we're producing, 3 academic articles and we'll circulate those to members of parliament. Yeah, right. I mean, thanks, this is not. In the Foreign Office in London, they train people, as soon as you arrive there, you get sent on a writing course. A friend of mine, a professor at Sussex, was seconded to the Foreign Office, and on his first assignment there, he was immediately sent on a writing course. And he said, look, I don't think I really need to learn how to write. I'm a professor, right? I write books, articles, and they said, yes, that's the problem. Right? The emphasis was every sentence, maximum length, 20 words. 20 words. Right? Just occasionally in a good academic article, I count the words just for fun. 60, 70, 80 words, sentences which go on forever, not even written by Germans who've at least got an excuse for doing it. I'm not asking that you be more complex in how you do the research, though I do think I'm saying research complexity. I think what I'm actually saying is pay attention to how to be simple about complex things. In the academic articles where you are arguing and talking with peers and you need to clear the ground, concepts need to be clear, theory must be referred to, the methodology must be made explicit, etc., and it's okay to use very long words and very long sentences. If you're trying to have a policy impact, then you're writing for a different kind of audience that's going to be reading it in a different kind of way, and in which, for example, write the end first. First, we quite often produce reports which are about 50 or 60 pages long, but we don't assume that anybody who's our real target audience is going to read that 50 or 60 pages. They'll read the executive summary. I referred to the World Development Report 2011. Did anybody, do you remember that? I mean, in our field, it's been very, very important, right? The World Development Report 2011 is about 365 pages long. Scott, you said you remember it. Did you read it?
I wrote more than
we are now having an exchange. I am one of the 6 people worldwide who was not involved in writing it, who has read the whole report. The summary that most people read, I think it was called an overview, was 65 or so pages long. The short version, which was the real summary, was 2 pages long. And just in case that couldn't hold your attention, right, there was a 2-sentence summary that was faithful to the World Development Report as a whole. It can be done. You can take very complex arguments and put them across in a way that a simple-minded civil servant can grasp and understand. Ingeborg, I don't think there is a stronger militarization of society going on at the moment in Western Europe. What I do think, though, is that there is this tendency in some political circles, faced with a serious problem in the Middle East, to, as I said, reach slowly for default mode, as if the only thing which they can think about is the use of force. And then, because they're not unintelligent people, the slowness is because they're uncertain how the use of force will work, but they don't see other options and other alternatives. Sometimes because I think they won't take a kind of a clear-sighted enough view. For example, in Syria, if what you are saying as a group of political leaders in Europe and the US and so on is that you think that there should be a political settlement, that that's the only way that the Syrian war is going to end, then it is really pointless to start out by saying who can and cannot sit at the table. If when you say these people cannot, you're ruling out everybody who's got any influence on the situation because you don't like them. If there's going to be a political settlement, it'll be a political settlement with some folk whom plenty of other people find really rather sort of upsetting to be around, but it'll just have to be. British government did it with the IRA, it can be done. ANC and the apartheid regime did it, it can be done. The second thing, the sidelining of the UN, I think it simply must happen. I mean, not that it's good, it's simply inevitable that it happens. This is a world still of sovereign states. Sovereignty is an enormously important political commodity. The number of sovereign states has increased in every decade since the end of the First World War, and it's going to carry on increasing. I mean, we nearly had a moment in September in Europe where the decision was pretty close that it might be taken to increase the number of sovereign states by 1, talking about Scotland. Right? And that issue is not dead. That will come back, and there will be further issues that will come back like that. And those states are not going to give up their political sovereignty. You're right that the reality of their autonomy is challenged by large multinational companies. It's also challenged by other bigger states. It's challenged even for the most powerful state by economic forces which they can't completely control, which nor do multinationals control them. And I think that is part of what the problem is, that there are issues that at the moment we do not have at that very large level institutions, whether governments or intergovernmental organizations, who are capable of managing those processes. We are being pushed around by them and sort of having to survive in the face of that. But I think that the sidelining of the UN, which you mentioned now, it's real, but it's been going on probably almost since the UN was formed. Sometimes the UN is the right place to be taking an issue as far as the US or government or whomever is concerned. Sometimes it's the wrong place. You would like it to be always regarded as the right place. But international law is the same thing. I would also like international law to be regarded much more as real law. But apart from in commerce, it's treated as, you can take it or leave it. We'll use international law when we want and not when we don't want to, because we can duck it and we can duck the consequences of it. Political leaders can do things which seem like they're war crimes and yet receive global legacy awards from development NGOs. I just imagined that problem.
Now there is a new Cold War advertised, and you could easily imagine that the focus and attention will go to this conflict in the coming years, and not on this pathway, so to speak. Now one present Russia as a real threat, while it has 1/10 of the forces compared to 1980s, for example. So it's a kind of very strange situation, and still it's succeeded to present it as a huge threat. What do you think about? My impression is that the focus will go in that direction, and not in the direction that you would want.
Yeah, I think you may be right. I think, though, that I don't really. I mean, obviously, I want to talk about what I think the issues are of the future, to think about how to prepare for them. At the same time, I don't really like crystal ball gazing. I think that the Ukraine, whole set of issues around Ukraine, including Crimea, are very, very particular to that moment in 2012, 2013, and this year of both Ukrainian and European Russian politics. And I don't like what has happened. I think that the West has behaved thoughtlessly, and I think that Russia has behaved illegally and unacceptably. But I don't see a broader deterioration of relations happening there, unless it happens for, in a sense, another reason. unless that provides an opportunity that can be exploited from one side or the other for a different agenda. But I don't see anything in that political moment, serious as it is, I don't see anything there which is necessarily generalizable to a broader, maybe to a change in the nature of relationships, yes, but to something going back to the Cold War, that I think is still far from certain.
Thank you. I think we try to collect a few more.
Sure.
Nils Petter.
Nils Petter, also at Prio. I didn't find myself in a great deal of disagreement with what you said, and I think taking a big picture is quite useful. But I'd like to mention 2 points. One was that under Good News you really only reported on state-based armed conflict and democracy. And I certainly think that development, if you want to report on the good news in our society, development belongs in there. I understand your skepticism about some of the economic indicators, but if you look at education and health as components of development in particular, I mean, 200 years ago, average life expectancy was 23 years, and now it's tripled. And that's probably among the greatest triumphs of mankind. I think deserves to be reported under that heading. The second point I want to raise was regard to climate change. You really only reported the impact of climate change on human security. It struck me when I read, and I haven't read the entire report from Working Group 2, but I've read several of the chapters. And one thing that struck me was the moderate tone of most of these chapters. So whether it's consequences for health or food production or the economy and so on, yes, there are consequences. They're probably on balance negative, but relatively minor compared to other challenges that we're facing, and probably also compared to our capacities for resolving them. The same is true for what the report has to say about the impact on armed conflict. The tone when it comes to human security is perhaps a little more dramatic, but that's, in my view, it's largely due to the very, very broad concept of human security that that chapter applies. It's so broad that I think it would be virtually impossible to establish whether human security, apart from climate change, is improving or not. The concept is so wide that almost any kind of social change becomes a threat to someone's human security, and I'm not convinced that that's a useful concept. So if you can't establish whether human security is increasing or decreasing, then finding out what the impact on climate change is on human security is also going to be extremely difficult. So I think this concept of human security needs to be decomposed. Armed conflict will be one of the components, and there might be other components, and then we would have a better basis for saying whether climate change is a real threat to human security. I personally, I think that the biggest threat of climate change is the insecurity. It's precisely that we don't know what the consequences are in a lot of areas, and that may be the best reason for trying to fight climate change, rather than pointing to specific negative consequences.
Yeah, thank you, Kristian Holmborg from Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center. You touched a bit upon kind of communication of research results and the need to engage with the policy community, but knowledge is not always enough, and the World Bank is able to distill their report to 2 sentences, but still, I guess that doesn't mean it translates into actual action. In your experience, from in various capacities, what has been the most sort of effective vehicle for inducing real or meaningful policy change in this area, whether it be sort of a policy brief, an op-ed in The Guardian, or whatever? Because, I mean, there's no lack of distilled messages of good research.
Thank you. If you will allow, Dan, I think we'll try to exhaust the list. It's going to be too late to sign up now because we only have a few minutes left. We have 3 more people on the list, and I encourage you to be as brief as Christian was, and or as specific if you can, because we're going to try to close on time. And I want to give Dan some time to summarize towards the end. Ingrid?
Yes, I want first to thank you, Dan, for giving us a very thought-provoking and challenging overview of what we have been working on for years, both as researchers and activists. But secondly, I wonder if still there is in this very general presentation the risk of also homogenizing perhaps a very diverse world, and we could talk a lot about that, but I want to pose that question. And secondly, I want to remind us all that in the beginning when we launched the Journal of Peace Research, there was a distinct end paragraph called Policy Implications. And honestly, we found it so difficult that it was dismissed. And to compensate for that, we launched the Bulletin of Peace Proposals, where we started at the other end, looking at what are the non-researchers proposing. And perhaps that would be a way that you should, again, walk on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wenche Hauge, I'm a senior researcher here at Prio, and I just want to say like the others, welcome to you and Dan. I would like to just go back to your first point about the positive stories for the upstream work. Because, and my question is simply how to make visible and make use of the good stories. Because I've had several projects focusing exactly on conflict prevention. I have one in Haiti where we've seen in the local communities people have very good models for conflict prevention, and they've prevented several conflicts and so on. And then comes the international community, total neglect of these. If anything, they make the work more difficult for these people. And you have another example at a different level in South America. The regional cooperation, UNASUR, has been very active in helping to prevent conflicts in South America. In Bolivia, the South American countries cooperated in also when the bombing of a FARC camp inside Colombia. They started together, and they've been in Venezuela. And there is almost no interest for this, because it's a story about something that's just positive, something that's been prevented. So how really to make it visible and make use of it.
And the final comment to gentleman back.
Yeah, my name is Jonkor. I'm sympathize with the lady that point out a very important point. I will go directly. My question is that not enough response. It is correct that sovereign states are stronger than NGOs, UN and EU. What kind of advice that you give to the UN and EU and sovereign state? Because when they get together, it's very difficult to compromise, to respond quickly to the international crisis like climate change. And we have learned more about the climate change of Copenhagen in 2009, when was G77 plus China have not compromised with the West, and the outcome was, I can say it was chaos. And now we are heading to Paris. What have in your mind outcome of that climate change is going to be? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dan, I'll leave it to you to wrap it all up.
First of all, to the climate change issues. I mean, on the one hand, I think that there is increasing confidence and certainty about that the climate increase in average temperatures is occurring. Climate is changing more or less in the way that has been modeled. The models are getting better all the time. There's huge uncertainty in there, and it's a long-range view. I mean, it's very hard to get a politician to say more than, yes, we must look after the condition of our grandchildren, when the IPCC is setting its projections at 2100. And we live at the moment in a political culture which emphasizes the now rather than the long term. London is protected by the Thames Barrier. And when the Thames Barrier was built in the wake of floods in the 1950s, when it was designed and it was started operating, which I think it started operating towards the end of the 1960s, it was assumed that it would need to be closed once every few years. In the last decade and a half, it has been closed a few times every year. Now, it is much more useful than it was thought to be at the time, when it was understood to be important to do it. I kind of wonder, I keep on asking myself, whether today the British political scene could produce that kind of decision. You know, last year we had floods, and we found out that the expenditure on the Environmental Protection Agency had been cut. It was only when the floods reached Maidenhead, which is a well-heeled conservative constituency on the Thames, that David Cameron said, and I quote, "There are no limits on expenditure for recovery." So there are cuts on prevention and no limits on recovery. Now this year, to be fair to the government, which I'm not often inclined to be, they have committed £2 billion into flood defences. But you know, the projections suggest that's going to need to be done across a long period of time. And actually there are some areas where people are living in Britain now which should be moved. This is enormously difficult terrain to be engaging in our political culture. So, you know, get people to be thinking about the fact that the climate is not simply going to change in 85 years' time, it is changing now. And this is where I really quite strongly disagree with you, Niels Petter, because in our work, we see instances which it may be or may not be to do with global climate change in quotation marks, but it's certainly to do with climate variability, where you see the conditions of people changing and they need to move, they need to shift, they need to, the patterns of movement of the herders in the Horn of Africa, the situation along the Niger River changing, and these changes feeding in different ways into their insecurity and into conflict. Not into, again, armed conflict at the high level, but lower level conflicts. Cattle raiding becoming more violent between different groups in Kenya on the borderland with Uganda and Sudan and so on. So I think that the changes are there, they are visible, and that is where the emphasis should go. And in some senses, Christian, that is what I would say, and maybe to Devenka as well, about, you know, what is the useful vehicles. The thing is that what you asked was, what's the most effective vehicle for inducing policy change? If you had said action, right? Everybody knows the most useful vehicle for inducing action is some very, very dramatic image and message. You know, tens of millions of people starving. Here's a picture of a starving baby. Let's get some action going. That action can actually be induced anyway. Its policy change is so much harder. One of the things about moving upstream, which maybe in this milieu you appreciate less well, is that one of the reasons to move upstream is in order to do policy. In a crisis, officials and politicians cannot do policy, right? They are working 26, 36 hours a day to stay abreast of what is happening, to think of what to respond, of how to do it. You talk to them at that point, and policy issues, you know, nonsense. You've got 30 minutes in order to make a decision. You can't sit down and think through a new policy at that point. You have to go upstream to make a policy change. What is the most effective vehicle for inducing it? I think the answer is it's complex risks, it's complex mixture of different vehicles. It's probably going to need evidence-based research. It's going to need some of the positive stories showing what can happen when it's done right. It's going to also need some jazzy presentation. It's going to need the 2 sentences. It may be helpful to have Angelina Jolie turn up. She, you know, her presence, and I've seen her sort of in action over the issue of sexual violence, and her presence has been very elegant, very well sort of done, so that it's not too just, you know, consuming all of the attention, not too starry, in other words, and it's been effective. So yes, a big attention-grabbing something or other for somebody or other, together with a well-based policy that is based on serious evidence. You've sort of got to be able to, you've got to excite people. You've got those people who need to be excited includes news editors, right? Because you want prominence from them. They include politicians who are going to be asking, what's in it for me? You've also got to be able to reassure them there's something real there. So you need the boring tome as well as the jazzy 3-minute video. Basically, you need every single vehicle at once, all moving in the same direction. You need workshops, you need activities, and you've got to get the politics of it right. You've got to create a political alliance, even if it were you were talking about just one government in which you had an overwhelming majority by one party. Still, actually, you need a political alliance within that party of different views. When you're talking about intergovernmental action or whatever, that coalition building, it has to go on for a long period of time. It's not a straightforward thing to do, but it does happen. Things do move along. The last thing, Ingrid, the risk of homogenizing the world. One thing, and maybe I should say about the talk which you've just sat through, and thank you again for your attention to it, is that the sort of where it comes from is looking at the world and asking, from an organization's point of view, International Alert, what do we need to say about this in order to be defining what we should be doing for the next 5 to 10 years? So that's possibly why the social economic development, which Håvard and Nils Petter and you, Henrik, have all pointed to, is less central there, because as an organization, we're working on peace-building questions, and that's been our lens and our angle to go in. When we are trying to figure out what we want to do in big terms, we're using very, very broad brushstrokes indeed. And those broad brushstrokes must simplify and homogenize. But the reason for doing that is so that we can think, what are the priorities? What are the directions? What are the ways in which we want to move in order to be doing work which is actually very, very granular? So this kind of broad overarching analysis, which I present, links to work which we're doing with organizations, with people in Lebanese political parties, with people in villages, with people in extractive corporations, and so on. So it's a kind of, I see exactly what you mean, but I think that the broad brush is necessary in the end to be sure that the granular detail is strategically well chosen to focus there, rather than just being, I mean, you must have, I certainly have come across, maybe I didn't when I was at Prio, but I have so much since, this whole thing of you have the brilliant analysis and you have the action, but the link between the two, could you just explain that to me? It's what I said about governments and international organizations at the moment. They acknowledge the importance of analysis, but they have difficulty linking the action. So you get an analysis which says, here's the problem, here's what we should do. Then you all leave the room and you come back and you say, what are the things which we've been trained to do? And you do those, right? Regardless of whether they're connected to the analysis. What we're trying to do with this is to take the broad brushstrokes and through that work, know that the granular detail makes sense.
Thanks, Dan. That was not only a sort of an elegant response to a lot of questions at the same time, but also a very good summary of a very interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.